there, and thanks for dropping in. So I'm about to start working on a treasure chest from The Legend of Zelda, which is actually something that I've made quite a few of already, so it might seem a bit redundant, but stay with me. So I made a bunch of different laser cut and edged Zelda chests, but none of them have really accomplished what I wanted. They all seem to be a bit of a concession or kind of a close enough effort. For ages, I have wanted to make a more game-accurate rendition of a chest, but only just recently felt like I actually had a real shot of accomplishing that. So Zelda has been around for a really long time now, and there's been more versions of the chests than there have been games. For this effort, I decided to go with the EX chest from Breath of the Wild, with a very slight modification. The EX chests are only in the DLC expansion of the game, and when you get that, you get a bunch of these chests hidden all throughout the world with special outfits and items in them. They have a big EX on them, and I didn't want to recreate that specific part, so I ended up replacing it with the Hyrule crest, but that's pretty much the only dramatic change. So I'm doing all of this work in Adobe Illustrator. The biggest challenge of the chest is the curved top and the angled sides. There are no true 90-degree angles anywhere on this chest, and I had to keep all of those angles in mind while working out how to lay out the sides and the pieces. The curved top is made of 11 long narrow planks that go around the curved sides. A second layer of wood is glued on top of the base to create all of the ribs and the details. I will end up cutting out a bunch of cross sections of the profile curve and gluing them together to make the bands that go over the curved top on each of the sides. Braining up the design for this chest was a legitimate challenge, and I'll admit that I cut out tons of pauses here and there where I literally just sat and stared at the screen trying to imagine in my head how best to lay it out and get the shape that I was after. Anyway, that's the bulk of the design process, so let's jump forward to the actual laser cutting. Once the design was finalized, I laid out all of the pieces and I imported them into the laser cutter software. This is being cut out of 1/8 inch plywood. Big chunks of this chest are double layered though, so it ends up being 1/4 inch thick, making it one of the more sturdy chests I've made. Each piece was individually sanded with the radial hand sander. I'm going to paint this thing and not stain it or poly it, but getting a smooth surface is still ideal, so I always do this first once something comes out of the laser. On to assembly! I'm gluing the bottom half together first, just a little wood glue in a puddle and a toothpick to apply it between the notches. A rubber band will hold the pieces firm against each other while the glue sets. Once all four sides and the bottom are together, they've got the correct shape established. Getting the top rounded ribs to maintain the same perfect rectangular base can be trickier. The last thing I want is for the lid and the bottom to end up not lining up properly. To avoid that, I started by taping the two profile curves onto the sides of the box with blue tape. I put glue along the notches and started putting the long planks into place. I put some glue in between each of the long sides to help set it more. And here I put some blue tape over the top just to hold everything in place while the glue sets. Time to start putting on the second layer details. Gluing a bunch of these C-shaped ridges in a line helped create the thick bands perfectly. I will be dremeling over them together shortly to keep the surface smooth and consistent across all of them. I use a Dremel and a grinding disc to level things pretty often. The pieces all lined up fairly closely, but there were definitely a few places where it was important that I was able to smooth things over and flatten things so that they lined up better. On the edges, you can see the multiple layers of wood coming out from this side, and it's kind of tiered and stepped. I used a Dremel here to grind this flat, and I'll be filling in the imperfections with wood filler later. I glued a crossbeam in along the bottom of the front and back of the lid, smoothing with the Dremel, and grinding the sides. I used the Dremel again to smooth and round over the corners of the bottom of the chest. The locking mechanism is a little hook that sits on the inside, and then a series of cylinders are glued together to create the tube that goes through. Technically I could have used a dowel rod, but honestly this was simpler, it guaranteed it was the right thickness, and it was the right length for what I needed. The layer right on the outside of the box has an opening in the center, and that's where the handle's going to come through. I check where the lid and the base lined up so that I know where to put the hook that's on the top. I use the Dremel to sort of grind the shape of the handle into something a bit more smoothed over, although honestly I think I might try 3D printing this handle later. Fit it into place and glue the end on. And here's where I apply the wood filler to try and smooth over the edges. With the wood filler set, I took sanding paper and I smoothed it over even more. I applied wood filler to the rounded edges here and the front bottom. And here I put a bit of blue tape onto the back to act as a test hinge. Now that I'm satisfied with the body of the box, I'm going to put a flat matte black paint as a primer coat over the interior and the outside of the box. After the first coat has dried, I flip over each of the pieces and I painted the other side. Once all of the base primer had dried, it was ready for the first outer coat. Thing was that I wanted the interior to stay black, and the curved lid has these tiny little gaps between the planks, and I didn't want any of the paint coming through. So I got out blue painter's tape and masked off the inside. So the EX chests are this plum purple color, and this one seemed a reasonably close match. There are several overhangs, and I had to make sure to come at it from underside angles and to give it multiple coats just to make sure I got full coverage. The borders and raised pieces of the chest are going to be gold, and I need to start masking things off. The Hyrule symbol and the markings on the side will also be gold, and I used the laser cutter to cut out some masks of my own, sort of, stencils out of masking tape. The tape is 4 inches wide and basically marketed towards people with 3D printers that print with PLA and not a heated build platform. The blue tape I found that I really like is the edge lock stuff. I think it's marketed towards baseboards. It seems to stick better and it gets a really clean line. I think next time I use the laser cutter to cut out a stencil, I'm going to go ahead and try using the edge lock stuff, even though the widest ones that I've been able to find is only like 1.5 inches. In any case, let's start masking off where it's going to stay purple. On the lid, it became obvious that the gaps that exist between the boards had made it so that the masking tape stencil didn't quite fit. I think in the future I'm going to break the stencil up into multiple strips. This would also let me use the better masking tape. I've got this set of embossing Stylus things, and I used them a lot while I was applying the tape. It's basically a little metal point with a little round metal ball on the tip. One side is smaller than the other, and I flipped back and forth a lot while I was working. I basically used it to push the tape into the corners, and then I went in with an X-Acto blade and cut off the excess. The side pieces were a perfect fit. I think in the future I'm going to do more of this, where I just cut out the exact size that I need on the laser cutter. Especially the front that has this round part for the locking mechanism. Speaking of the round thing in the front, I tried using this tiny pinstriping masking tape in hopes that I could sort of curve it around the circle, but it became clear really fast that that wasn't going to work, so I just cut it into tiny strips and I just went around the circle like that. Those little metal stylus things were super handy on this thing. I'm going to include a link down to them in the description. I don't really know what they're called other than pointy stylus things, so I imagine searching for them would be kind of hard. Masking, masking, masking. This can definitely be one of the more tedious processes in this, but it can make a huge difference if it's done well. I'm definitely thinking I'm going to try cutting out these shapes with the laser in the future. Those 2 half circles on the sides were so easy and quick versus doing it manually. Masked off the bottom, and masked off the inside. I didn't really want to try and tape off the whole interior, so I ended up stuffing a piece of paper towel in there. So I didn't record it, but I did go in there with some sandpaper and I sand along the edges here, sort of smoothing things before I actually apply the gold paint. With this metallic paint, the smoother the bases, the better. I use Rust-Oleum specialty metallic spray paint here. It's probably the best gold spray paint that I've used. I've used their silver and their bronze as well, and they're both okay, but the gold is the real standout. I also hand sanded the rounded corners on the base. Sometime later, first coat has dried and I'm flipping them over to do the second coat. I'm also making sure to get any portions that I couldn't really reach before with the spray because of overhangs. And time to remove the masking tape. Revealing the purple underneath is actually kind of neat, honestly. Peeling the tape off of the Hyrule crest on the lid makes it obvious why I prefer the baseboard edge lock tape versus the plain old regular blue tape. The edge bled quite a bit in several places. I'm definitely going to break the design down into narrow strips and just cut it out of the better tape next time I make one of these things. So to make up for the bleeding, I'm going to hand paint a bit, but since I want to make sure it's the same color, I have to use the same spray paint. To do this, I took this little Dixie cup and I sprayed the spray paint directly into the cup. You do this enough so that you get a small puddle and you can just use that with a brush. I went over it all with a very fine tip brush and cleaned up all of the areas where the paint bled past the masking tape where I didn't want it. Fortunately, it didn't do this very much. Mostly just the Hyrule crest and one little spot on the front. And at this point, I decided it was time to put on the hardware. So for putting on hardware, I always pre-drill some holes using my Dremel. The last thing I want is for the wood to crack or splinter when I'm putting in screws. You know, it may seem odd, but finding screws this tiny is bizarrely difficult. Especially self-tapping screws, you know, that's where they've got a pointy tip so they're good for screwing into wood. The ones I do find are usually shipped out of China and take ages to finally arrive. Anyway, they're hard enough for me to find that I'm putting a link down in the description. At the very least, it provides you with some proper search terms if you're looking for something that's like it but close. The chest in the game has a pair of side handles. I decided to go with these little metal handles that I already had, even though they don't actually look like the handles from the game. I might consider making cutout handles or maybe even 3D printing some so that it more accurately matches the game chest. And if I 3D print the side handles, I'll probably go ahead and 3D print the front handle too, but for now this is what I decided to go with. Once the metal hardware was done, I turned my focus back to the front handle. The EX chest from the game has a silver handle with a red handle wrap. I just used some acrylic paint and applied it with a brush. I think I'll make some adjustments to this handle in the future, maybe even paint it beforehand next time. And once the paint had dried, I was done! Most of the time when I make a new design, the first version of it is full of flaws and it takes me several revisions to be legitimately happy with the design. But overall, I'm actually super happy with this one. There are a few things that I'll definitely be adjusting before I make a second one, but it's all pretty minimal. I'm just really happy with this. It's the first time I feel like I've made a Zelda chest that actually looks like a chest from the game, and not just inspired by the chests in the game, or some generic chest that just happens to have a Hylian crest on it. Spinny, spinny, spinny! I just really love this thing. I'm super happy with the end result. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed joining me for this journey. I enjoyed making it. And if you like this video, check out my channel for loads of other just like it, and subscribe for any more that I make in the future. This chest and others like it can be found on my Etsy store. They're made to order and I take custom requests as well, so if you want special engraving or initials or a birthday wish etched somewhere onto it, that's always doable. Thanks again for joining me, and don't forget to be awesome. Bye-bye!